This is the phase that you might have been waiting for. This is where you trick your friends that you are a better painter than you actually are. And you're definitely going to trick the viewer into thinking it is more realistic than it actually is. But more than tricking people, this is just about being efficient. Remember, this is commercial work, and you probably have a deadline. So one approach would be to paint all these details by hand. And certainly if you're working on something that's very stylized, that might be your only option. But if what you need to do is paint realistically, photo details have a wonderful way of just pushing it up to that next level. And even though there's a lot I could describe about how the technical side works, really all we're doing is saying you have an underlying base matte surface rendering or glossy surface rendering, and then using a blending mode on a layer over top, we are going to just sort of overlay details. And the blending mode I'm going to use for all of these different layers is multiply. And what multiply does is it takes anything that's dark on your layer and it adds that onto the stuff below it. But anything that's light is essentially ignored. So knowing this, I assemble a sheet of details. And I do this based on like the reference I look at and also just kind of my personal history. I ask myself, what cool stuff would just set this scene? And with that question in hand, I go to the website cgtextures.com, which is an awesome free site, and I download appropriate images. Now the images don't start out the right values. What I need to do is collect a page of images, and then I need to use the levels command, or in this case also hue saturation, and they end up needing to look like this. So what you're seeing here is a base light value, and then on top of that are dark details. And remembering how multiply layers work, what we're going to get here is it will ignore the background and it will only add those dark details. So armed with this knowledge, we are ready to start overlaying details onto our image. So the process is pretty straightforward. I move one decal at a time from my trim sheet into my canvas. And then once it's in my canvas, I'm essentially using two different tools. The first one is Free Transform. Now this is where that nice grid overlay is going to be helpful because it needs to match the perspective of the image. Nothing will kill your hard work faster than just slapping a flat overlay on top of your image and ignoring perspective. I see this all the time for beginners and it looks terrible. So remember, mind the perspective. Then once it is in place, you probably have too much of the detail because really this is all about subtlety. You don't want to go too crazy with these details, otherwise it'll get noisy again. So I'm going to use layer masks to hide away and selectively reveal bits of the decal. So as you've heard me say a million times before, here I'm applying a layer mask to the layer, and then I'm painting with black and white to hide and reveal the image. These days, the way I like to do this generally is to hide everything, as in I make a layer mask, I fill it with black, and then it disappears. And then I'll get white out and begin to selectively reveal bits of that layer. And so this gives me total control. It makes sure I don't accidentally include too much, and really I only put those details where I want them. Now some of these things are super easy. It is a standalone item, and I've essentially given myself a spot for it in the image, and all I need to do is make sure it's the right shape, and then I'll adjust the levels a little bit, and then it's in there. No problem. But some of them are going to take a little more work. Sometimes you're thinking of your trim sheet as more of a malleable raw material, not necessarily a finished result. So for instance, if I want to have cool dangling wires interspersed with conduit, but I didn't necessarily find that reference, I'm just going to work with what I've got. So the first thing I need to do is clean up this one chunk of pipes to be able to sort of repeat more cleanly. And then once I've cleaned that up, I can duplicate them and lay them next to each other, and it looks pretty realistic, good enough. And then in this case, I know I want to have sort of dangling bits that are curved down from the rest of the straight segments. And then again, no problem. In this case, I'll just cut a little chunk of it out, use the warp command, and then up in the left-hand corner of the warp command, there are these nice presets. And here I'm going to use the one called arch, and I'm going to give it a negative value. And then once I've got my pieces, I sort of connect them all back together, make myself a larger repeat unit, and then I start putting it in position. Now, if I had found a perfect photo of this sort of thing right on the internet, I would have been able to skip this step. But there's a lot of situations where you can envision a cool detail, but you can't find a photo. So that's where it takes some sort of Photoshop collage techniques to take what you do have, mess with it a little bit, and then you can have exactly what it is you're looking for. Okay, the motorcycle is a challenge because a motorcycle is something that we've all seen before. And whether or not you know it, there are certain mechanical bits that are going to decide whether or not you believe this is real or fake. And I'm no motorcycle expert. So for me, the ability to use a photo and to just sort of slap it on top is actually the best way to approach this. So here I've prepared a few different cutout parts from internet photos, and I'm going to try and incorporate these into my image such that they sort of match the rest of the painting. And the best tool to do that is levels, because what I need to do is make sure the values match the values in my character. Because these photos were taken in the sun and my character is in the shadow, so I'm going to need to tweak it a little bit. But as you can see, this is just sort of an efficient use of photos. I targeted one specific area in the painting that is both important, as in it's a character that you're looking at, and it also is important to have very realistic details. And again, not being a motorcycle expert, for me it just made sense to go to the source, to just make photos work in my image. And since the perspective doesn't match, you can see that this takes some doing. And this is one of those cases where knowing how to do photo manipulation is really handy, because these techniques, they're not really painting. What you're watching me do here is collage, but in the grander scheme of things, it's helping my painting. So learning about how to use free transform and the warp tool is very worth your while to just sort of use photos selectively when you need them. And the final bit on this motorcycle is something I can paint, which are these wheel hubs, which are really just sort of cylinders. So for this, I will use a circular marquee and I'm going to do a stroke, just really anything to get me a circular band of color. And then it's just a matter of using free transform to put it in the correct perspective, hide away what I don't need with a mask, and then just paint on top. But believe me, I don't like to rely on photos. This is not a way to do all of your painting. But for very specific cases, it's just the most efficient way to work. So I take this approach for the entire painting. I cover everything I want to with a little extra detail from photos. And as you can see here in the roof, sometimes it does require a little painting on top. You want to integrate these. It's pretty embarrassing when you have an obviously out of place photo sort of ruining your painting. What you're doing here is enhancing. You're not trying to show off. And then eventually you are finished with the photo texture phase.